right, this is Chapter 20, Milestones of the Past Century, War and Revolution, 1900 and 1950. And I'll just stay up front. I'm not a huge fan of the way your book organized this section. It put two massive events together that, in my opinion, I wouldn't have done it that way, but I see the point. I've said that many times, but we have a lot of ground to cover in a very short amount of time. So if it just seems like we're skimming over a lot of these events, that's why. If you can imagine, I've got to cover World War I and World War II in one PowerPoint. So if you're looking for the kind of information on World War I and World War II, where you go into a lot of the different battles and whatnot, that's really something that you would get like in a class that's focused on those. Like if you get higher up in like your 500 level classes for history, then sure, you can find a class solely dedicated to World War I and or World War II, or maybe the World Wars together, so you could be more specific on that. But alas, this is not one of those classes. So again, skimming the surface here. All right, our introduction. The First World War was described at the time as the war to end all wars. It did nothing of the sort. So said UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at an event in 2014, marking 100 years since the outbreak of that global conflict. World War I, of course, starting in 1914, though the United States does not enter until 1917. And in 2017, on the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, Russian President Vladimir Putin offered a largely negative commentary on that event. Could we not have evolved by way of gradual and consistent forward movement, he asked, rather than at a cost of destroying our statehood and the ruthless fracturing of millions of human lives? So two huge events here that are very much connected, and that's World War I and the Russian Revolution, both of which we'll talk about. And again, it's unfortunate, I think, that the timeline of the book puts this together, because I think World War I gets largely overlooked in the United States. It ends in 1918. We don't enter till 1917. So for the United States, again, it's kind of, I feel like it's almost like a skipping point on the way to the much larger World War II, which looms a lot larger in our imagination. In fact, when you ask people what they know about World War I, usually they'll say something about World War II. You know, Hitler, Nazis, concentration camp, all that's World War II. But it's hugely significant. We'll try to get into as much of it as we can. So the Great War, as it was called at the time, marked the beginning of the 20th century, so called the Great War because they didn't know there was going to be a World War II, so they didn't call it World War I at the time. That's something we do at the end. It's essentially a European civil war. A lot of issues that I see in student papers are people confusing Europe with a country. Europe is not actually a country. Europe is a continent with many countries in it, so please make sure that you're understanding that. But the different countries of Europe, this is where the outbreak of World War I is going to start, though it is a world war because the various colonies of these European countries are also involved, as well as the United States and the Ottoman Empire, which kind of is and kind of isn't part of Europe. It also provoked the Russian Revolution and a spread of communism to different regions of the world. And the Great War was followed by several main events. Number one, the economic meltdown of the Great Depression, starting in about 1929. The rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, all very interconnected. We can't talk about the rise of Nazi Germany without talking about the Great Depression and World War I, because we can't say for certain that the Nazis never would have gained power without the Great Depression or World War I, because we don't know. But it seems highly unlikely that that would have happened. Typically don't see the rise of a party so hateful as the Nazis in when times are well. When things are going well and everyone's happy, that's not typically when you see things like that happen. You also have the Chinese Revolution giving power to the modern Communist Party, and it spurred changes within the colonial worlds of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, which will culminate after World War II in the eventual dissolution of imperialism. That's after World War II. All right, focusing on the First World War again, 1914 to 1918 for us we enter in 1917, but officially it's 1914 to 1918. So by 1900, Europeans or people of European ancestry controlled most other peoples of the world. We know this. That should be a review. We've talked about imperialism, etc. So looking at the beginnings of the Great War, the modernization movement and Europe's rise to global ascendancy had sharpened traditional rivalries between the European states as they start industrializing, as they start building up militaries. It just intensifies these rivalries. And again, you're throwing in modern weapons made possible by industrialization, and that's just going to make things worse. And you also have new players on the scene. Both Italy and Germany unified in about the 1870s. They were not unified countries prior to this. They are, again, new on the scene. Germany broken up into different, in some cases, tiny little principalities. In other cases, larger nations like Prussia. Italy divided up amongst different powers as well. So here we have the world in 1914. Gives you an idea of what we're talking about. Again, Europe is in gray. Note all the different countries in Europe. And note Great Britain. And notice all the British dominions that belong to it. And everything in tan is also a nation that's under some sort of colonial rule. So you can see pretty much Africa, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia, is pretty much all under colonial. Okay, around 1900, the balance of power in Europe was sharpened by two rival alliances. You have the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria, and Italy, and you have the Triple Entente, which is Russia, France, and Great Britain. And these alliances turn what is, I don't know if minor incident is necessarily the best way to put it, because people died. Two people, that is, died, and that's the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Duchess Sophie. So of course that's very terrible, but when you think of the grand scheme of things, and that the fact that millions of lives are going to be lost in World War I, it doesn't seem like an event that should have set off the crisis that is World War I. And yet it did, and it did because of these rival alliances. So the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. You can see the Triple Alliance is often called the Central Powers during World War I. You can see they're called that because they're in the middle. Italy is going to switch sides and going to join the Triple Entente, which is signified by purple there. So they start off the war on the side of the alliance, and then they switch sides because they get quite a bit of land promised to them by the Triple Entente in order to switch sides. And also they have a long-held resentment towards Austria-Hungary, because Austria-Hungary used to rule large swaths of Italy. So, on June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He and his wife were visiting, and so they were assassinated. Now, Austria was determined to crush the nationalist movement that was going on in Serbia. And Serbia, on the other hand, had Russia and Russia's allies behind it. And a general war broke out in August of 1914. Again, there's a lot going on here that we can't get into. Austria controls a large amount of the Balkans, of which Serbia is a part, though they do not control Serbia. But Austria-Hungary is very fearful of growing nationalist movements in the Balkans because they don't want to lose their holdings in the Balkans. And so they decide on a very tough stance towards Serbia, and they give them a list of these ultimatums. And the ultimatums are just outrageous. And to Serbia's, to their defense, they agreed to some of them, which a lot of other diplomats in other countries were like, they're never going to agree to any of these. Again, they're so outrageous. This is obviously just a pretense for Austria-Hungary to go in and to punish Serbia. And the question comes up, well, was Serbia even really responsible for this assassination? This was done by a nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. He's a Serbian, but he's not acting on behalf of the government. there's some argument back and forth on how much the Serbian government knew, etc. But regardless, they give them these lists of demands, and Serbia agrees to some of them, but not all of them. Austria-Hungary says, nope, not good enough, and they declare war on Serbia. Serbia has Russia as its allies, and by default, Russia's allies, because again, Russia's got allies in France and Great Britain. So this is how all these countries are going to get involved, because remember, Austria-Hungary also has allies. They've got Germany, and they've also got Italy, though again, they switch sides, and as well as the Ottoman Empire. So that's how all these other countries get dragged into this original conflict, which was between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Again, it's way more complicated than we're making it, but we just don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of it. But it has a lot to do with the growing tide of nationalism and the waning of these imperial powers. A lot of people will refer to this era as the fall of giants, because these big imperial powers headed by these royal families, many of them are going to be no more after World War I. Most of the monarchies are going to be toppled after World War I, pretty much with the exception of Great Britain and a few others. But yeah, it's going to have a lot of significant outcomes. So factors that contributed to the outbreak and the character of the war: popular nationalism, as we just mentioned, that's at the heart of it. Serbia and other growing nationalist movements in the Balkans, and Austria-Hungary's fear of those growing national movements, because imperialism by definition means you're bringing together all these disparate groups of people together under one rule, but yet nationalism is the opposite often. Nationalism is, well, we have our own identity, so you have these conflicting ideologies that are at work here. You have industrialized militarism that's going to just really not only contribute to the rivalry between the nations, but also the bloodiness of the war. And again, Europe's colonial empires. So legacies of the Great War. Most expected World War I to be a quick war. I don't know why everyone always assumes that every war is going to be a quick war, but they seem to. I don't know. They rarely are. Germany was finally defeated in November of 1918 with the famous signing of the armistice on 11/11/11, November 11th at 11 o'clock in 1918. It became a war of attrition. It's famous for being for trench warfare. Again, I know many people might be very interested in the military side of things here. We just can't get into all of that, the trench foot and the battles and et cetera, because we just unfortunately don't have time. We only have a couple weeks left here. And it became a total war. Each country's whole population was mobilized and affected in some way. And I think that's something that we really overlook in America, is the role that civilians played in, they play in any war, but definitely in World War I and World War II, because they weren't fought on our soil. And so America, thankfully, was largely left untouched. But the civilian casualties in these wars are going to be huge as well, because they're going to be swept up in it. And again, that's something that we really don't have experience with here. The last war really fought in our soil was the Civil War. So definitely out of anybody's living memory here. It's going to result in the enormous expansion of government authority, massive propaganda campaigns to arouse citizens to fight for their nations. You're going to see women replacing men in factories, same as in World War II. And labor unions accepting sacrifices for the greater war effort. So again, the lives of civilians, women, children, men who aren't able to fight, it often that gets overlooked here in the United States. We tend to focus on battles and things like that because it wasn't fought on our soil, but people suffered tremendously and had to deal with huge food shortages, energy shortages, etc. The war also left widespread disillusionment among intellectuals in its wake. It led to the question of Enlightenment values and the superiority of the West and its sciences. How great could everything be if we had this war and it was just so terrible? Again, some people had experience with wars before. It's not like they'd never seen a war before, but a war on this scale, a truly world war with just a massive loss of lives. I mean, to give you just kind of a brief idea of what we're talking about, you see in some villages and small communities, if you look at census records after World War I, you see women either having to marry men who are much, much older or much, much younger, because that generation of men that went off to fight in World War I didn't come back in a lot of cases. Some people did, but you see sometimes entire villages where they all died. They went off to war and none of them came back. That's how bad it was. And so seeing things on this scale, and if you're living in a battle zone, because these battles took place, where people lived, this is hugely it just shook people to the core. And so it led a lot of people to question, like, well, are we really so superior here in the West? And are our values really so great if it's led to a war such as this? So not surprisingly, given that war brought tremendous social change, again, enormous casualties, also promoted social mobility. Again, you have some cases where you see entire young men of villages just completely wiped out, and that allows for, again, more social mobility because unfortunately there's less people. Women increasingly won the right to vote in various parts of the world after World War I due to their contribution, including here in the United States. Many women started flouting sexual conventions. Again, this is a time of great questioning. How good are our values if something like this could happen? Just think about like the flappers here in the United States in the 1920s. A new consumerism also emerged. People are looking to buy things because, again, if you have your values shaken to the core and you're just questioning everything, like, well, how good of a society are we if this could have happened? You're looking to fill that void with other things. And a lot of people, same as today, turn to stuff to do that. Well, we'll buy stuff and that will make us feel better. And of course it doesn't, but it is something that continues to this day. And also radio and movies became vehicles for popular culture as well, creating popular culture within countries, bringing people together. We're all watching the same movies, we're listening to the same music, etc. Politically, you're going to see a rearrangement of the map of Central Europe. You're going to see the creation of an independent Poland, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia in the Balkans, part of the former territories of Austria-Hungary. As you can see there, I know this map's a little small, but you can see those nations are in yellow over there as ceded by Austria-Hungary. And this created new problems of ethnic minorities. So in some ways, it's what certain groups wanted. They want independence from a country that they don't feel a part of, such as in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. But on the other hand, you're also putting together groups that they don't feel nationalistic towards each other. And that's going to create problems later on down the line, including a genocide in the 1990s in that region. And it's also going to trigger the Russian Bolshevik Revolution of 1919. The Treaty of Versailles was created in 1919, and it also created the conditions that will lead to World War II. So much scholarship of history goes into looking at the Treaty of Versailles, looking at its shortcomings. Where did we go wrong? What happened? Because the Treaty of Versailles was meant to prevent something like this from happening again. So there are a lot of varying opinions on what went wrong with the Treaty of Versailles. But remember what we talked about at the end of the last chapter. Have to be very careful about being too condescending on people in the past. And even historians have an issue with this because we have the benefit of hindsight and they don't. So my personal take on the Treaty of Versailles, we looked at this a lot, especially in graduate school, debated it a lot in graduate school. I think they did the best that they could with the conditions they had at the time. I don't want to say World War II was inevitable because I don't think it was, but again, I think it's very easy for us to be condescending. And it's not unhelpful to look back and to be critical because this is how we learn, right? We don't want to look back at the past and just disregard the parts we don't like or just think, oh, well, they were stupid, they didn't know what they were doing. No, we want to have a critical eye, and so we can learn and we can move forward. But again, you have to do it without a sense of condescension, which I think a lot of people do. So what happened? Germany lost its colonial empire and 15% of its European territory. They were required to pay heavy reparation. It took them a long time to pay those reparations off. They suffered restrictions of their military forces, and why? Because they had to accept the sole responsibility for the outbreak of the war, and Germans resented this treaty immensely. There's a whole lot of back and forth about whether or not the treaty was too harsh on Germany or not harsh enough. Traditionally, the view is the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, it punished Germany too severely, and that led to the rise of Hitler and to World War II because they were so resentful of it, etc. But more recent scholarship has looked at, well, it wasn't harsh enough, because if it was, they wouldn't have been able to rebuild their military so quickly. They allowed Germany to keep a lot of its industry, and that basically allowed them to get back on their feet, not only in terms of industrial production, but in terms of production for their military, and they bounced back pretty quickly. I mean, they suffered greatly in the Great Depression, don't get me wrong, but their military certainly bounced back rather quickly for a country that was supposedly, really put upon by this treaty. So again, there's back and forth on that. There's a very famous saying amongst military historians that in order to defeat your enemy, you must defeat him completely, and that we didn't defeat Germany completely. But again, that would be something that you'd really get into at a more higher level class, looking at World War II or World War I and World War II specifically. The Ottoman Empire was completely dissolved, similar to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, broken up into two different countries, Austria and Hungary. The rest of their territories given independence. Same thing with the Ottoman Empire. This also resulted in the unfortunate genocide of Armenians, by a genocide that many people in Turkey today deny ever happened, but we have quite a bit of evidence stating that it did in fact happen. You have, as a result, the creation of new Arab states, and you also have British promises to both Arabs and Jews to create that are going to create new problems in Palestine. In Asia and Africa, many gained military skills and political awareness. Again, colonies were called to active service as well. There were battles that not a lot of people talk about that were fought in the colonies, various colonies throughout the world. And Britain also promised to start the process of creating self-government in India in return for their help in the war. Additionally, Japan is going to be very much strengthened by the war. We've talked about them beginning their modernization process in the last chapter. That's continuing here. And Japan's assumption of German privileges and territory in China inspired some Chinese to adopt Soviet-style communism, which of course will take off after World War II. A big one for the United States is that we appeared as a global power, which we weren't really prior to this. We're a big nation. But politically speaking, we tended to be very isolationist, and so our true potential was not realized quite as much as it was after World War I. Our manpower had been important for the defeat of Germany. Again, can we say definitively that they would have lost without us? No, because that's impossible to say, but it seems highly unlikely. Also, the United States became Europe's creditor. Again, our land was largely untouched. Our industries are untouched because the war was not fought here. And so we became a creditor to many European nations in need of funds. And many Europeans were fascinated by Woodrow Wilson's ideas. Woodrow Wilson essentially created much of the Treaty of Versailles, and he created the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, though the United States never joined the League of Nations due to our fear of permanent European alliances. But these very progressive ideas were appealing to many in Europe. Wilson in recent years has come under fire, for racist comments that he made, so he's become a much more controversial figure that he was. All right, spread of communism. You have the Russian Revolution and Soviet communism. The troubles in World War I were the catalyst for the Russian Revolution, but things were really bad prior to this. Again, I know I did, and you can, if you're interested in it, you can take a whole class on the creation of the Russian Revolution and things like that. But things were not great. So it wasn't just World War I. But again, World War I is the catalyst. It's the straw that broke the camel's back, I suppose, if you would. So Tsar Nicholas II, pictured there in the bottom right-hand corner, lost all power by 1917. He was forced to abdicate the throne. As a result, a provisional government with representatives from multiple political parties was formed. But this massive social upheaval opened the door for the Bolsheviks, also known as the Communists, to seize power. A 3-year civil war followed, leaving the Bolsheviks, who now call themselves communists, claiming the ultimate victory. Eventually, the communists under Joseph Stalin sought to build a socialist economy, but conflicts persevered under totalitarian leadership, leading to the terror or great purges of the late 1930s, in which many, many, many people died. So again, going back to Putin's comments at the beginning, could this not have been something that could have been controlled, or a revolution that could have happened more gradually? Could it not have come about and not resulted in the loss of so many lives? So, the Great Depression represented the most influential post-war change. It suggested that Europe's economy was failing. Again, think about this great shaking of the values that people had. And there were worries about capitalism, industrial capitalism. Is it failing? Is it not working anymore? It had generated individualistic materialism. It created enormous social inequalities, and its instability, the fact that something as catastrophic as the Great Depression could happen, caused great anxiety. And this is a time period of a lot of upheaval in all different aspects of society. So the Great Depression hit in 1929. It was a worldwide Great Depression. We tend to think of it as only happening here in the United States, but economies are so intertwined at this point that it's pretty much worldwide. Contracting stock prices wiped out paper fortunes. Many people lost their entire life savings. World trade dropped 62% within a few years. As a result, businesses contracted. And unemployment soared. It reached 30% in Germany and the United States by 1932. I mean, think about that. That's huge, 30%. I mean, we think about the Great Recession, which started in 2008, and that was terrible, of course, but at the height, the unemployment was about 10%. So if you think about how just terrible 30% unemployment is, an idea of the Great Depression and the seriousness of it. Numerous causes contributed to the Great Depression. It wasn't just the stock market crash, though that's part of it. The American economy had boomed in the 1920s, but by the end of that decade, factories and farms were producing more goods than could be sold. That's a problem. Europe was also impoverished by World War I and didn't purchase many European products because people couldn't in many instances. And Europe itself was recovering and started to produce more of its own goods. Additionally, speculative stock market had driven stock prices up artificially high. So again, the stock market crash is a part of it. But worldwide empires made the Great Depression a worldwide problem. Countries or colonies dependent on the export of a few products were hard hit. That's always a problem. If most of your economy is dependent on one thing and you're not diversified and that one thing is no longer in demand, that's a problem. These tensions, especially in Latin America, frequently resulted in military takeovers, interventionist governments, import substitution industrialization, and authoritarian and populist politics. Because again, people question their government, they question their economic system. How could something like this happen? In the same way that they're questioning things as a result of World War. And of course, that means that the Depression was a major challenge to governments. Capitalist governments had thought that the economy would just regulate itself, and clearly that wasn't happening. And then on the other side, the Soviet Union's economy grew throughout the 1930s. So in response, some states turned to what they called democratic socialism, with greater regulation of the economy by the government and more equal distribution of wealth, again, controlled by the government. Specifically, the New Deal in the United States was Roosevelt's reforms seeking to end the Great Depression. They were a series of public spending programs which permanently changed the relationship between the government, the private economy, and individual citizens. The New Deal didn't work very well economically. Our economy only improved with the massive government spending that resulted in as a result of World War II. So it helped with morale for people to see the government doing things, trying to make changes. But in terms of pulling us out of the Great Depression, it did not. World War II did that in the United States. And shouldn't surprise you that Nazi Germany and Japan coped best with the Great Depression. Why? Because these are regimes that under other circumstances, again, like I said, probably, can't say for sure, probably wouldn't have been able to come to power. But the fact that the Nazi Party was able to help economically gave people a reason to want to support it. And the same Japan in the 1930s. So you can see number of unemployment in the United States, and you can see again how significant it was between the United States, Germany, and Great Britain. Significant in countries. Also, democratic political ideals came under attack in the wake of World War I. Again, you have the challenge of communism. In the 1920s and the 1930s, authoritarian, nationalist, anti-communist regimes were a more immediate problem to the victors in World War I. You have the establishment of authoritarian states in Italy, Germany, and Japan, and they had become allied with each other between 1936 and 1937, leading to new anxieties and new fears amongst other countries, fears that were well-founded. So, a new political ideology known as fascism became important in much of Europe in the period of 1919 to 1945. What is fascism? Well, it is intensely nationalistic political ideology. It exalts action over reflection. It looked to charismatic leadership. All these fascist nations had dictators which were in power, Mussolini, Hitler, etc. They were against individualism, liberalism, feminism, parliamentary democracy, and communism. And they were determined to overthrow existing regimes and were very conservative and reactionary. They celebrated traditional values. Most of them have some sort of rhetoric about restoring some sort of lost civilization. Italy, returning back to the glories of the Roman Empire. Nazi Germany, the mythical Aryan race, etc. So fascism appealed to dissatisfied people in all social classes. Again, it's feeding on the dissatisfaction that came about as a result of World War I and then the Great Depression. Again, fascist movements grew thanks to the devastation of World War I. It's hard to imagine that if things were going well, it would have caught on the way that it did, but again, can't say that for sure. It appeared in many Western European lands, and it became important in Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Spain, and achieved major power in Italy and Germany. But again, even though Italy and Germany were outright fascist states at this time, it was popular in other nations as well. Fascism first developed in Italy, in which you have a lot of social tensions that are exacerbated by the economic crisis following World War I. And so Benito Mussolini put together a private army known as the Black Shirts, to use violence as a political tool to assert their authority. And Mussolini's movement took the ancient Roman fascists as a symbol. So again, looking back to ancient Rome, looking back to a time of past glory. Again, it's reactionary. Let's restore the Roman Empire, the glories of the Roman Empire. And once in power, Mussolini built state power. He embraced Catholic culture as well, different than in Nazi Germany. Women were portrayed in highly traditional and domestic terms, very similar to Nazi Germany. And Ethiopia was invaded as a first step in the building of a new Roman Empire. Again, looking back to the past. So, German fascism was more important than that of Italy, mainly because of the strength of the military power that they're able to establish. It took shape as the Nazi Party under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. Pretty sure everybody knows who that is. But it did have many similarities. Again, they were allies, so there are some similarities. It also grew out of the collapse of the German imperial state after World War I. At the fall of At the end of World War I, Germany's fall meant that the Kaiser, the emperor, if you that's what Kaiser means, of Germany was deposed, and so a new government, the Weimar Republic, negotiated peace. It was in it, traditional elites were again disgraced because they were the ones in charge under World War I, and they lost. And there was a creation of this myth that Germany had not really lost the war, but had been in some way betrayed by civilians, including socialists, communists, and Jews. So again, we've done this thing. It's hugely shameful. We lost a war, but now trying to explain it away. Well, it really wasn't our fault. And of course it's not true, but looking for a way to explain what had happened. In the 1920s, different vigilante groups assassinated hundreds of supporters of the Weimar government. It's new, so it's not strong. It's very weak. And on top of it, it gets hit with a widespread economic depression, inflation, the Great Depression, and everybody wanted decisive government action, and it wasn't happening. And so the National Socialist Party, or the Nazi Party, won growing public support. To give you an idea, the Nazis had only 2.6% of the vote in 1928 and 37% in 1932. As Chancellor, Hitler suppressed all other political parties, arrested opponents, censored the press, and assumed police power. Fascism. He successfully brought Germany out of the Great Depression, again, increasing people's loyalty towards him. And by the late 1930s, he had the majority of support of the people. And he also did this by invoking rural and traditional values, which appealed to a lot of different people. He also used the Jews as the ultimate scapegoat for the ills of society. This is unfortunately something that is not new in the history of the world, and he just takes it and runs with it. There's an emphasis on racial revolution, and Jews were increasingly excluded from public life, leading to the ultimate persecution of the Holocaust. Nazism in Germany was deeply anti-feminist. It limited women largely to the home, highly promoted the cult of motherhood because they wanted to increase the number of Aryan Germans, and of course also unfortunately decrease the number of those who are not Aryan Germans. So if you are Aryan Germans, you are encouraged to have as many children as possible. So the rise of Nazism represents a total moral collapse within the West. Again, just hugely frightening when you look back at what had happened, and the fact that, again, people, they had support. They had a majority of the support in order to do these things in Germany, and it's hugely unsettling. They also made use of modern science as well, and not only in terms of building back up the military, building back up the economy, but also as an argument for racial superiority. Japanese authoritarianism. Japan was also a newcomer to the great power status. Like Germany and Italy, it moved to authoritarian government and territorial expansion as well. But there were important differences. Japan played only a minimal role in World War I, and at Versailles, Japan was an equal participant on the winning side. And things are, of course, going to change greatly throughout the 20s and the 30s. In the 1920s, Japan was apparently moving towards a democracy. We see an expansion of education, creation of an urban consumer society, greater individual freedoms, including for women, and lower class movement for greater equality. So all not looking like a swing towards authoritarianism. But then tensions of modernization and industrialization emerge. You have the Rice Riot of 1918, union membership tripling in the 1920s, tenant unions multiplied in the countryside. You have a women's movement demanding suffrage and the end of legalized prostitution. And you also see the growth of socialist and communist parties. And so the elites reacted to all of this with alarm. A lot of political activists were arrested, some were killed. Additionally, the Great Depression hit Japan hard. It led many to doubt that democracy and capitalism could help resolve this national emergency. And this led to the development of radical nationalism, or the revolutionary right. So you see a shift in Japanese public life in the 1930s. Major government posts went to prominent bureaucrats or military figures, not party leaders. Not surprisingly, then, the military became more dominant, became a hugely militaristic state. Free expression was increasingly limited, and the government adopted many themes from the Revolutionary Right. Major public work spending pulled Japan out of the Great Depression rapidly. And again, that would give them the idea that authoritarianism, at least it works, were no longer suffering economically. And an increased government oversight of economic matters. Generally speaking, Japan within its own borders was less repressive than Germany and Italy, but their expansion into other nations certainly was repressive. So World War II was even more global than World War I. There are independent origins in Asia and Europe, because historians like to debate things endlessly. Some debate that, well, the Pacific theater shouldn't even be considered part of World War II, and the European theater, they should be looked at separately. For our purposes, we're going with the traditional, it was all part of World War II. But again, there are two different theaters, and they are two different origins. And dissatisfied states in both continents wanted to rearrange international relations. Okay, looking at Asia and the war in Asia, because it starts first here. Japanese imperial ambitions arose in the 1920s and 1930s. They had already acquired influence in Manchuria after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. We talked about that in the last chapter. And in 1931, the Japanese military units seized control of Manchuria. And many Western leaders criticized Japan, and that just caused them to withdraw from the League of Nations, basically saying, we don't care if you criticize us. And the rest of the League of Nations didn't do anything to act, as they will not do anything to act in terms of the various invasions done by Japan, Germany, and Italy. There's a lot of hand-wringing, there's a lot of condemnation, but not a lot of action. And by 1936, Japan was more closely aligned with Germany and Italy. In 1937, there was a major attack on the Chinese heartland, which started World War II in Asia. So again, it predates the outbreak of World War II in Europe, which is 1939. International opinion was against Japan, and again, the Japanese have already withdrawn from the League of Nations, and they also feel threatened by this. There is a growing belief that Western racism was in the way of Japan being accepted as an equal power. So again, the belief that the condemnation is not coming from a belief that their actions are wrong, but it's coming from a place of racism because they're an Asian nation. Japan was heavily dependent on foreign strategic goods, especially from the United States. A lot of these are going to be cut off by nations like the United States, and that's going to spur their attack on Pearl Harbor. Additionally, imperialist powers controlled the resources of Southeast Asia, and the Soviet Union, with its communist ideology, loomed large in Northern Asia because this formerly Russia, now Soviet Union, of course, stretches all the way into Northern Asia. So, between 1940 and 1941, Japan launched a conquest of various European colonies, Indochina, Malaya, Burma, Indonesia, the Philippines, and they presented themselves as the liberators of their fellow Asians from these Western powers. But the reality was a highly brutal rule by the Japanese. This also resulted in the December 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor joined the Asian and European theaters of war into a single global struggle because the United States declares war on Japan, and the allies of Japan, Germany, and Italy declare war on the United States. So, again, it is now a single global struggle. But again, that's debated. This gives you an idea of the various wars fought, or the various battles fought in the Pacific. Again, I know World War II and World War II battles are a huge interest to a lot of people, and it's probably a letdown that we don't get to talk about all of them, but unfortunately don't have the time here. The road to war in Europe. Again, two different theaters. Some argue two different wars. We're going with the one war way of looking at it here. The Nazis promised to rectify the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles for their people. And at first, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union were unwilling to confront German aggression, same as what happened with Japan. War was perhaps actually desired by the Nazi leadership. Hitler stressed the need for living space in Eastern Europe, living space for a hopefully, in his mind, hopefully increasing Aryan population. They began rearmament in 1935, In 1938, they annexed Austria and the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia. And in fact, we're not getting into it here because, again, we're skimming here. But the leadership of Great Britain and France agreed to this. They agreed to giving parts of Czechoslovakia to Hitler because they thought that that would make him stop, and of course it didn't. And in 1939, that was the final straw. There was an attack on Poland by Nazi Germany, and that triggered the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Germany's new tactic of blitzkrieg or lightning war was initially very successful. They quickly gained control of most of Europe. They rapidly defeated France. They started a unsuccessful air war against Britain. And they also started another unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union, but they were stopped here by a Soviet counterattack in 1942. And the Germans were finally defeated with the help of the United States in May of 1945. All right, consequences and outcomes of a second global conflict. An estimated 60 million people died in World War II, and again, that includes civilians. More than half of the casualties were civilians. And again, I refer back to my point that I talked about in World War I about us really forgetting about that. The line between civilian and military targets were blurred. Think about the Blitz in the UK and the damage caused on British cities, and the counterattack that the Americans and the British did on German cities. And the Soviet Union suffered more than 40% of the total number of deaths in World War II. Again, many of those civilian deaths. China also suffered massive attacks against their civilians. In many villages, every person and animal was killed. Just hugely significant here. The rape of Nanjing from 1937 to 1938, 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians were killed, and countless women were sexually assaulted, hence the title given to this event. So again, we forget about this in the United States. We forget about the brutality inflicted on civilians as a result of war. Again, bombing raids on Britain, Japan, and Germany showed a new attitude towards total war, like we just mentioned. The government's mobilization of economies, people, and propaganda reached even further than ever before, even in World War I. Huge numbers of women worked in industry and served in the military, and there was also widespread instances of violence against women, including rape in countries in which fighting occurred. We can't ignore the fact that the Holocaust occurred as well. Some 6 million Jews were killed in the genocide. Millions others were also murdered in camps. And the legacy of the Holocaust leads to a questioning of Western values. Again, how could something as horrific as the Holocaust be allowed to happen? How could it happen in the world that we know it, in a modern world? How did this happen? And it also leads to the migration of many European Jews to Israel. And it leads to the definition of this new crime of genocide. And we unfortunately have seen genocide occur even after the horrors of the Holocaust. So again, it leads us to question, like, what does this say about us as a people that we have these instances of genocide happen? World War II also left Europe completely impoverished with its industrial infrastructure in ruins, millions of people homeless or displaced. Again, cities were bombed and people live in cities. Industrial areas were bombed. People lived and worked there. These are now completely devastated. And as a result, weakened Europe could not hold on to its Asian and African colonies, leading to the end of imperialism. There is also going to be a communist takeover in China. The Soviet victory over Germany gave new credibility to the communist regime. They played a large role in helping to defeat the Nazis. The Soviet authorities also played up a virtual cult of World War II, resulting in communist parties taking power across Eastern Europe, on the other side of the so-called Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill called it. And there was a communist takeover of China by 1949. There's also going to be growing internationalism, the creation of the United Nations as a mean for peaceful conflict resolution, taking the place of the unsuccessful League of Nations. I say unsuccessful because it did not stop World War II from happening. the establishment of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in 1945, and the continued dominance of the United States as a global superpower. All right, learning from history. You no doubt have heard the phrase, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." However, most historians are cautious about drawing particular lessons from the past. History is complex enough to allow different people to learn different lessons. You can look at one event and have multiple interpretations of the event. And as I said before, we don't want to not learn from the past. We don't want to not look at something critically. But at the same time, events are very particular to the time period in question. And it doesn't mean that lessons can't be learned. But again, we have to look at it within the time frame. It's why some people are a lot of history teachers are very for teaching history backwards, because you never seem to get to the modern events because you always run out of time. But I am not a proponent of that, because again, I think you lose out on the very, very significant cause and effect of history. So again, historians are skeptical of the notion that history repeats itself. I would argue history doesn't repeat itself. People repeat themselves. And again, we can learn from the past, but we also have to keep in mind that the past occurred in the past and as a result of a very specific set of circumstances. And the wars of the 20th century have led to many unexpected consequences, which in the last 3 remaining chapters we will get. So, chapter question for today. Read the following sources. They just go in order. It's 20.1 through 20.5, and answer the following question. To what extent were the ideas of these sources new and revolutionary? In what respects did they draw on long-standing traditions? And again, have these ideas been completely discredited, or do they retain some resonance in contemporary political discourse? History is not entirely in the past. Again, it occurred as a result of certain circumstances, but it's not entirely in the past, and we can still see effects of historical events going into today. So that's something that you, specifically looking at these sources, I want you to evaluate.